attention, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I promise this is the last you'll see of me for a while. But let me introduce you to my friend Andrés Gluski, the CEO of the AES Corporation. AES is one of the most important companies, and certainly one of the most important energy companies in the U.S. Andrés is actually the leader in the motivation behind Blueprint 2025, and he's really built and manages a tremendously successful company. But he also has a lot of interesting experience working with the IMF in the past, working in Venezuela, working in other countries around the world. And he's a tremendously visionary leader. So let me introduce to you my friend Andrés Gluski.
All right, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. What I'm going to do today is talk about two things. One, talk a little bit about the transformation that we're seeing in the energy sector in the U.S., and then I'll get to Blueprint 2025 and show some numbers and some considerations from the private sector. Because one of the things I think that's very interesting about this conference, you're going to hear different opinions and different viewpoints. But there are certain things upon which we agree. And I think that's the part of having a vision that is important. Because there'll be different paths to get there. But if we're in line in terms of where we want to go, I think we can be quite effective as a group. So the first thing, let me talk a little bit quickly about just AES, give you an idea where we're coming from, what my biases will be as a speaker. AES is a Fortune 200 company. We're in 18 countries. And we have about $40 billion of assets under management. So we have actually listed companies below AES. We have private partnerships. Right now, we have about 6 gigawatts under construction around the world. So our construction projects today are about just shy of $10 billion. So we invest in infrastructure, we invest in long-term projects, we also invest in some of the new energies. So one example of this, quite frankly, is IPL in Indiana. Our business in Indiana is Indianapolis Power and Light. It's a regulated utility. It's been around for 125 years. It's about 500,000 customers. And it has one of the lowest tariffs and one of the highest rates of service in the Midwest. So it's very well seen, very well established. Now, with the new environmental regulations, we've had to make major investments at IPL. So IPL, when we started this program, was about 80% coal. And what's very interesting, last year was the first year in the history of the US that natural gas produced more kilowatt hours than coal. So we've had the Clean Power Plan, which many of you have seen. I'm sure the lawyers in the room are well acquainted with, which was going to enforce more stringent federal emission standards on our coal plants. And the recent is that it's sort of been upheld by the Supreme Court, whether the federal government had certain authorities at the state level. But the states are going on with it. So what's really happening in the industry, we're proceeding as if the Clean Power Plan is going to go in effect. And each one of us is really looking at what are the state regulations. So we have about 2,000 megawatts, that's 2 gigawatts of state-of-the-art coal. But we really had to put in emission controls. And the primary driver of that was the mercury and hazard toxics, is known as MATS regulation. So you had to have less output of things like sulfur dioxide, mercury, particles per million. And also, in separate, there's also been new rules about wastewater compliance in the state of Indiana. So what we have done is take our best plants and invest $700 million in cleaning the emissions from those plants. And we've had drops in certain emissions as high as 80%. So the one part, this has been a very big investment program, about $700 million. But at the same time, we're building about 1.3 gigawatts, 1,300 megawatts of natural gas. And the reason for that is in the States, you really have had an energy revolution due to shale gas. And the price of gas today is about 1/4 what everybody was projecting it would be today say, 5 years ago. So, and that's here to stay. Everything has indicated that cheap gas is going to remain in the States. So we're building 700 megawatts of new build, and we're converting 600 megawatts of coal to gas. And that's another $700 million investment. So what's very important about this is that at the end of the day, what does IPL look like? Well, it used to be about 17% natural gas, and that's going to be half natural gas. And it's very interesting. If you look at a lot of the natural gas fleet in the US, it actually was designed for peaking, because since natural gas was so expensive, you only used it when certain hours you had an extra peak, because it's not efficient to peak with coal plants. Nonetheless, you can see that about 50%, close to 48% remains coal. It's much cleaner coal than it was before. Now, this was possible. This $1.5 billion program was possible because you had a very good regulatory system in Indiana, in the sense that if you made the investments, you knew that you could put them in your tariff base, and you could recover your investments. So at the end of this program, we're going to double the asset base of this regulated utility. So this will be good for consumers, good for the environment, good for the state of Indiana. Now, one thing when we talk a lot about competitiveness, it's very interesting. People don't talk about this, but the US has the cheapest electricity costs of any major industrialized country. And this is a major advantage that the United States has, and it's likely to remain for some time. So when people talk about, competition, this is something that the United States is really blessed with. The United States has two fantastic advantages. One, it has the best system of navigable rivers anywhere on the planet. And two, due to its abundant natural resources, has very cheap energy. However, what we're seeing is other changes happening as well. So one of them is sort of photovoltaic electricity generation. So in our case, we have, solar panels and photovoltaic farms, as we call them, are around the world. But we're starting to see that also in the case of Indiana, and having long-term purchase agreements with solar farms. And interestingly, Indianapolis is actually the second city in the US that the highest penetration of solar rooftops of anywhere in the US. It's not a place that you would expect it. But what is really driving this? Of course, you've had some tax advantages. But you've also had, quite frankly, a 60% reduction in the cost of photovoltaic panels over the past 5 years. So this trend is likely to continue. This is going to make a major effects on our industry. But when people talk about it completely replacing the large plants that supply the grid, I think what people don't realize is the amount of investment it would take to get that done. So I think large power plants, large dams will be around for quite some time. But this is certainly affecting the market. So for example, in the case of the US, it's changing the way electricity is dispatched during the day. If you look at those states that have the most renewables, such as California, actually from like 12 to 3 o'clock on sunny days, the marginal cost of electricity is almost zero, because you actually have households selling the excess electricity to the grid. But then everybody comes home, it's around 5, 6 o'clock, turns on the air conditioning, turns on the TV, starts cooking dinner, and you have this enormous ramp up. And that's quite frankly, very inefficient to do with thermal plants, because you have to heat them up. And you have to go into this peaking, which again is not so. So we are investing heavily into renewable technology, which is really lithium-ion energy storage. And if you look at the cost has dropped 70% in the last 5 years, and we project another 50% over the next 5 years. Now, batteries, these are basically the same batteries that are in your computer, have tremendous advantages from a technical point of view, because you can instantaneously ramp them up. So again, if you need to ramp up immediately, thermal plants will be much less efficient. You can use the batteries. So you hear a lot of people talking about this is the energy of the future, or the business of the future. How it will revolutionize grids, because you'll be able to have a lot more renewables, such as, for example, the case of California. There are also problems with renewables in terms that they're intermittent. You're watching the Super Bowl, clouds come overhead, voltage drops. You wouldn't want everybody's TV to black out. So what happens with the battery, arbitrage, let's say, that energy during the day, but you can also improve the quality. You don't have these frequency fluctuations. So today we have 106 megawatts up and running in 4 countries, which is the US, Chile, the UK, and Netherlands. And we're going to have it shortly in 2 more countries, which would be the Philippines, the Dominican Republic, and India. And this is cost competitive. We actually don't subsidize this. We make the same sort of return on capital on these projects as we do on the rest. So this is a very interesting development. But again, I see this as complementary to the new technologies, more renewables on the grid, and a switch from coal to cleaner coal and natural gas. And the technologies really of things like carbon capture and sequestration or gasification of coal, there are very few cases where we've really seen that this is cost effective. I mean, if you had a coal plant sitting on top of an old oil well, you know, perhaps the numbers work. We've also seen, quite frankly, tremendous cost overruns in the nuclear renaissance in terms of time delays, in terms of cost delays. So this is a little bit what is our view of the electricity sector. And this will affect many of you in terms that we do see continued need for large investments in the US. We see retirement of coal plants. We see continued cleaning up of coal plants, building out of gas plants. But we also see that renewables are every day more competitive. And new technologies, such as energy storage with lithium-ion batteries, make renewables even more competitive. So this is the sort of projection of what is needed in the US through 2030. It's $140 billion of investment in power infrastructure. About 40% of that would be renewables. Natural gas would be about half. And others, such as gas peakers or energy storage, could be about 16%. What's very interesting also about the energy storage, it also can replace additional investments in transmission because it allows you to have run higher loads on your transmission lines. So these are the new technologies, again, which are going to affect the electricity sector in the US, where the US is cheaper and, quite frankly, leading many countries. And it's kind of in style right now just to criticize the US and say we do everything wrong. But if you actually look at what the United States electricity sector, and say compare it to Europe, where you've had a lot of subsidies in renewables, quite frankly, often subsidizing renewables which aren't technically the right renewable for that country or that city. So, to give you an example, Germany has been leader in solar photovoltaics. But the average irradiation, say, of Dusseldorf is the same as that of Anchorage, Alaska. And I kid you not. So that's not where you would probably want to put solar panels in, or places that are covered by snow. So from the private sector, what we really like are frameworks where it allows the private sector to say, well, you want renewables, you want zero carbon. Let us figure out which is the best way to provide that. Now, the numbers, again, are very large. But in the States, when you talk about infrastructure, you kind of have a tale of 2 cities. Because if you look at the private sector, I have no doubt that the private sector will come up with $140 billion, just like it did for rail, just like it did for other sectors. So it's very interesting. Where you do have the right regulatory framework, the private sector is responding. The other thing that we also have to be conscious of, we're coming out of a decade that's been about as benign for large infrastructure investments globally as there's ever been in the history of mankind. You've had a tremendous, let's say, savings in certain countries, making a lot of funds available, and you've had the United States Fed having, QE1, QE2, very accommodative interest rates. So that combination, really made infrastructure funding easier. Now, I think that's about to end. The Fed is tightening. You're also having some of the huge surplus countries, such as China, undergoing a tremendous rebalancing. Well, they'll have less trade surpluses to fund infrastructure abroad. So I think really now is the time to think smart of how are we going to meet those infrastructure needs for the future, because it's not going to get any better than what we've had the past decade. So let's talk a little bit about the Blueprint 2025. And Norm was very generous to say I was one of the first to sign up, but that's just proof that, fools jump in where wise men fear to tread, once again. But I've been very interested in the subject of infrastructure. And basically for 2 reasons. One, as a US taxpayer, I really think that there's a tremendous need in the country for more infrastructure, newer infrastructure, and you see that wherever you travel. And second, we're no longer live in times where the federal government's going to be able to pay for all that infrastructure. So new solutions are possible. And I think, given my international experience, I've seen many programs which work in many other countries. Now, there tends to be a reluctance, especially in large countries, to say, well, that worked in Singapore, that's not going to work in mainland China type thing. But I really think one has to keep an open mind and see what examples can we use that were successful and apply them to a bigger stage. Just because they were applied on a different stage doesn't mean they not necessarily won't be applicable to a larger stage. So here are some numbers, and I think this morning you haven't been subjected to a lot of numbers yet, so I'll start. This is nominal dollars, investment in core infrastructure. So what is interesting, again, these are nominal dollars, so this is not inflation adjusted. And what you see since about 2004, we've had a 19% decline in federal spending on core infrastructure in nominal dollars. So if you look over that time period, our population has grown, our needs has grown. If you look at state and local governments, about a 5% decline. Now, I think this is very important to look at relative to the economy. And so if you look at O&M, maintenance, and you look at the capital infrastructure, we've gone from a peak of around 5% of GDP to about 2%. Now, I think one always has to be a little bit worried about these comparisons just as a percentage of GDP, because I remember days when the Soviet Union was going to bury the United States because they were spending 20% of GDP on investments. They were just the wrong investments, and they weren't very productive. So the question is, how productive can you be? But normally, where you see low rates of investment and GDP, sustained GDP growth, is because you went through something like a privatizations, where you had a large capital stock that was being inefficiently used. That's certainly not the case for the US. If you look at cases even like Germany, which has, I think today, pretty close to zero population growth, and most of its cities have built out that infrastructure, you're talking about a number about 4%. So it's very hard to think of the US being competitive if it's going to underspend so drastically in infrastructure. Now, there are a lot of sort of political reasons that this has been the case. And what's interesting about this forum, I'm sure a lot of us have different views of how to best approach this. Some of us may be more market, some of us may think more of sort of federal spending. But I think we all agree that without increasing our spending on infrastructure, it's very hard for the United States maintain its lead in many industries. And I'm personally fortunate enough to be on Obama's export council. There's about 24 CEOs in where we meet. And again, I'm not an exporter. I think the reason I was put on the council is because I should be a large importer of US products around the world for these large infrastructure projects. And so I brought a different perspective. One of the things that struck me, there wasn't like an infrastructure committee. There were financing committees, there were a lot of trade agreement committees, but there was no infrastructure committee. So I worked with Norm, and we sort of thought about this idea. Well, today the US Export Council does have an infrastructure committee. And everybody, I think, even those who aren't in the infrastructure, came around to the view that if you don't have good infrastructure, it doesn't matter how efficient your plant may be, you're not going to get those products efficiently and cheaply to other markets. I always remember a story, actually an anecdote. I was talking to the head of one of the large glass manufacturers globally. I believe it was Owens, Illinois, but I'm not sure. And I asked him which was his cheapest, most productive plant in the world. And he said, in India. He said, subsidized energy costs, low labor costs, it's extremely competitive. And I said, do you export a lot from there? And he says, nothing. And I said, why? And he said, because the infrastructure is so bad, so much of our product's broken by the time it gets to the port, we really can't compete with China. So we export from China. So, I mean, that's a simple anecdote to tell you, there are a lot of things beyond just the cost of manufacturing. And I actually think that the US is very well positioned for the future. If you think about things like 3D printing, they will take away the advantage that many countries possess of, say, cheaper local costs to have zero transportation to do it closer to your consumer, and that the US is the largest consumer market. So if you combine that with good infrastructure that makes our people more competitive, if you combine that with low energy costs, the future could be quite bright for the United States. And when I talk about infrastructure making people more competitive, we tend to get lost a little bit in sort of economic talks about, competitiveness, but it's also quality of life. If you have inadequate highways and you have to spend 2 hours getting to work and 2 hours coming home, that really affects your quality of life. And to use a bit of an international example, this is likely one of the reasons productivity in certain countries, in certain big cities like Sao Paulo or Mexico City is stagnant. And that's just because it takes people so long to move within the city. And it's so unpredictable that they're less productive. So that's something I think that we could really address in the States. And a lot of this, and one of the things I commend Norm for, is to really go beyond, let's say, a group of high executives, is to reach out to the public sector, to reach out to larger groups. Because this has to be about improving people's lives. This is not about, maximizing, a trade surplus or corporate profits. It's really about improving people's lives. So infrastructure can do two things. It will directly improve people's lives in terms of affecting their daily life, the quality of their drinking water, the quality of the air they breathe, the quality of their communication, the quality of their transportation, and indirectly through the jobs they have, that they can be more competitive. If we're more competitive, there will be more jobs in the US. And the US does have some tremendous natural advantages, despite what you may be hearing, let's say, some of the campaigns that tend to portray us as total losers. If you're dealing with an international portfolio, let me tell you, the United States does not appear to be sort of the biggest loser by any means, and a lot of countries are very envious of the US on this. So here is talking a little bit about 2020, and it's kind of, if you look at for 2025, you'll see that if we maintain the current trends, we'll be investing about $200 billion a year by 2025. I think everybody clearly feels that that's inadequate. With the goals of 2025, we'd be doing about $750 billion. So if you look at it, is this feasible? It sounds like many billions. Well, certainly. There's no question that an economy the size of the U.S. That will be reaching $20 trillion a year can afford this. And actually, if you look at the cost, just to put it in perspective, for example, the war in Iraq was $4 trillion. So can the United States afford it? Yes, absolutely. There's no question that we could afford it. The question is this a priority to get done? And I think it must be, again, for the quality of life, for the quality of jobs, and for the quality of the country as a whole. So it's very interesting. Again, when you preach about infrastructure, you always, most audiences you're preaching to the choir. The real question is how to get it accomplished. So Brookings Institution, talking about globally, it's about $90 trillion. Now, there are tremendous differences between the infrastructure that is needed between the richer, developed countries and the developing countries. And we'll have a number of speakers from Africa where there are tremendous opportunities because they're going for, let's say, more basic infrastructure. What is very interesting is can they leapfrog technologies, like was done in telecommunications. So many nations, for example, in Africa didn't go through the copper lines that you would bury, for miles and miles. They went straight to cellular and other means. So it's very interesting. The world population will be growing. We have increasing infrastructure needs. It's not a unique problem for the U.S. The difference, I think, for the U.S. is that it really hasn't been a national priority to increase infrastructure spending for many, many decades. And we've been living off the great investments that were made in the past. And again, I do think there's a difference between those that are solely private and those that are public-private. The IMF agrees as well, and I'm an ex-IMFer, and I can tell you that for the IMF to come up and say you need to spend more in any sort of fiscal program is tough. So the need must be extremely obvious. So here's an example that I like to use, which is Canada. And Canada is really a leader in P3 projects. And so the Canadian economy is roughly 1/10, a little bit less than 1/10 of the US. But if we look at what their 3P programs have done over the last 10 years, well, they've directly created almost 300,000 jobs. almost 500,000, well, more than 500,000 if you think of the whole knockdown effects of it, about $32 billion in wages, and it's calculated at almost $50 billion in increased GDP. So if you extrapolate that by 10, that is possible for the US. And what's very interesting is that, Americans tend to think of the Canadians more social in terms of its healthcare programs, et cetera. But one of the things that they privatized, for example, were their airports and ATC systems. So today, Canada has one of the most advanced ATC systems in the world. Actually, it's been rated #1 in some. If you fly into Montreal or you fly into Toronto, you'll see the quality of the airports. And those have been parts of P3 programs. Well, they've gone from a drain on the local treasuries to the largest taxpayers in some of the municipalities. So again, there's no reason that a similar program could not work in the United States. I mean, I can't think of a more similar test case than Canada and then taking it to the US. And again, it's not that I'm advocating this because I'm coming from the private sector. As a recovering economist, I can tell you one of the problems I have with a lot of the models when they talk about privatizations or getting the private sector involved is that, there's an input called labor and there's one called capital, and you maximize it in this model. Well, but the problem is how efficiently is it being used? And so what we know is that the private sector, you're under much more, let's say, stress, or I would say there's greater impetus to minimize costs and to be efficient. On the other hand, there are things that only the public sector should and can do. So it's really when you combine those two that I really think that you get some of the best results. Now, what is interesting, and a lot of times when you discuss this in the States, it's kind of like it can't be done here. And it hasn't been done. One of my big surprises when I started looking into this with Norm was that the US governments, including states, is actually the biggest owner of infrastructure in the world, more than the People's Republic of China. So that the opportunities for public-private partnerships, or actually outright privatization, is enormous. Now, there are different jurisdictions, there are different needs, and there's always the question that the private sector will demand a competitive reward. But the question is, what is the cost of, for example, not having a road or not having a bridge? Is probably going to be higher in terms of avoided costs than paying a higher toll. So there was a survey that CGLA did of our members here, and this, as you can see, it's a very unhappy group. Between very dissatisfied and dissatisfied is like 80% of respondents in terms with the discussion in infrastructure and the state of infrastructure. And there was about a 15%, which is extremely happy. I haven't met them myself, but so definitely I think everybody reacts that there's a tremendous need. I think we know how to address this issue because it's been addressed by other countries in, quite frankly, far more difficult political and economic circumstances than the US is facing today. So this is going back a little bit to the Blueprint 2020, and kind of, I wanted to highlight some of the things that I thought were most important. So first is the vision. Again, I think it's really important to have a vision of where you want to go. This is a very complex subject. It covers many, many jurisdictions in the US. But if we have a common vision that we want to have world-class infrastructure by 2025, that's unifying. And as I said, for example, taking something like the Export Council or many other forums that you all participate, if you make that a priority, it will get done. The second, the funding financing, definitely that has to be addressed. I mean, first, I think the opportunities have to be made available, but certainly like a national infrastructure bank would be extremely helpful to get a lot of these projects kicked off. And it's certainly something that other countries have. Now, I do think, politically, people have to be brave to speak up. I mean, we're living at a time when the US Exim Bank comes under tremendous questioning. The US Exim Bank doesn't cost taxpayers a cent, and essentially is fundamental for making, for leveling the playing field. If you can buy an Airbus jet with financing from Europe, or you can buy a Boeing jet with no financing, well, it's clear that you're going to go for the one that has more advantageous financing. So some of the arguments, like this is crony capitalism, for example, I don't export, I import. Where possible, I prefer to import US goods and services. But if there hadn't been an Ex-Im Bank, it certainly makes it more difficult to choose US goods and services. When you're getting Jexim from Japan, Kexim from Korea, and many different agencies from the Europeans. But it is interesting that you're not getting really sort of sound debates on this and saying, what is it costing the US taxpayer and what are the benefits of it? But you do get sort of a soundbite of crony capitalism. Again, I don't consider myself a crony, or maybe I would like to be a crony, but I don't think I qualify. The other issue which is very important is regulatory. It's getting harder and harder to build infrastructure projects anywhere in the world. And part of it is because of the, I would say, maze of regulatory approvals that you must get. Now, I have seen cases where countries took a decisive moves and saying, we're going to cut the amount of red tape to get a project done. So this is not saying not to have oversight, but just have more efficient oversight and not have multiple jurisdictions or multiple agencies, which make it extremely complex. I have been told that, for example, if you look at the regulations today in the US to build a new nuclear power plant, it would probably fill, if you printed it out, at least half of this room to the ceiling. So it's very difficult when you have that amount of regulation and that amount of paperwork to, quite frankly, get a project done. So it's not very surprising that there have been so many cost overruns and delays. The other one I thought was very interesting is to really attract the best people into the sector, sort of a national infrastructure university. Clearly, a major move into infrastructure would have a very dynamic effect on the US labor markets. There are very few things which soak up as much labor as infrastructure projects do. But you're also going to need, as we go into more high tech, like some of the things that I was showing, people to be trained. For example, if you put in a lithium-ion battery energy storage plant, it's very different from operating a traditional plant. And you're going to need computer programming skills. You're going to need other skills. So making sure that the labor force is adequately trained for this buildup is absolutely essential. And the other thing is to have a view of what are really the strategic areas and strategic projects that we should pursue. So it's an interesting time. We're in the midst of presidential elections. Now's the time to start talking to those people who may have positions in the administration to see what role infrastructure can play, and can they set the right tone during the first 100 days. So I think we live in interesting times, and certainly infrastructure is, I think, is much more on the public discourse. You're not going to get anybody who's saying we don't need to invest a lot in infrastructure in the US. But I really think it comes down to what are the practical approaches to make that happen. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? If not, I think we're a little bit behind schedule, so we'll let you go back to the salt mine. Oh, there's a question? Okay.
I was just below the... Thank you very much. First of all, we would really like to appreciate your presentation, because it does give a lot of insights. But first and foremost, I'm also glad that you've confessed for being a former IMF expert, because we've had a lot of arguments with them in Africa, and more specifically in Kenya and other countries in East Africa. They always told us not to venture into building the new infrastructure that we are building today. And they also thought we were not ready to do big-time infrastructure. In fact, in the year 2003, when we wanted to develop the integrated national transport policy, a lot of those institutions told us, you are not ready, and we wouldn't want to support you to do that. We had to bite the bullet by ourselves. Having been a young graduate from a master's class at the university, I was appointed by the minister to spearhead that, because that was the area I was really interested in. And we developed it, and we shaped the new programs that we are building today. And we believe that there is a very strong need